What is up, people? Today I'll be ranking every Yoshi game, and you might think that I'm making this video because I'm the world's biggest Yoshi fan, but the truth is there are plenty of other side-scroller platform franchises that I'd rather play over Yoshi, including other Mario spin-off series like Donkey Kong and Wario, except that Mario is actually a spin-off of Donkey Kong, and so are Banjo and Conker, but anyways. It just so happens that I have finished every Yoshi game, and once you've finished every Yoshi game, there's only one thing left to do, which is to rank them. But I figured I would just put that disclaimer out first, since if you are a Yoshi fan 333, don't take this list all too seriously. It's just based on how much fun I personally had with each title, as someone who doesn't claim to be a super fan. Obviously, some of these Yoshi games have a lot of different versions, but I'll only be choosing what I think is the best version of each game to actually rank. And in dead last, we have Yoshi no Cookie Kuruppon Oven Day Cookie. So I already broke my own rule where I said I would select only one version of each game, since this is technically a version of Yoshi's Cookie. However, it really contains two games in one, and for this spot I'm only counting the newly added Cooking mode. Now you may not have known that this game exists, as there are only 500 copies ever produced and only released in Japan. And this Cooking mode was developed by National Human Electronics, aka Panasonic, to promote their new Kuruppon oven. This Cooking mode I don't even think counts as a video game. You got this overworld where you can walk around and go into different buildings to follow recipes and cook things, but only virtually. Why the hell would someone want virtual cookies that you can't even eat? The closest this gets to being an actual video game is the Ingredient Mansion, where you search through cabinets of a kitchen to find the required ingredients, which is just RNG. There's also enemies that you can only quote-unquote fight if you got lucky and found the item necessary to defeat them, like the fly swatter. If you encounter an insect, it only serves to waste your time. You're literally not allowed to open anything for a full minute if one appears. Who thought this was a good idea? So yeah, easily the worst Yoshi game, as I'm not sure this even counts as a video game. Next is Yoshi Topsy-Turvy, aka Yoshi's Universal Gravitation for the GBA, which does indeed count as an actual video game, a baffling one at that. Nintendo 4 years before this released Kirby Tilt and Tumble, a game where you tilt the Game Boy to move Kirby. While this game had frustrating controls to me personally, it still makes sense as a concept, as it's a top-down physics-based game where Kirby is a ball. Yoshi Topsy-Turvy makes no sense as a concept to me, and I wonder why we couldn't just get a normal new Yoshi game. There was an almost 10-year gap between Yoshi's Store and Yoshi's Island DS, which I would consider to be traditional Yoshi games. This here, I would certainly not consider traditional. I don't think a single person ever thought, you know what I need in my handheld platformers? Having to tilt my Game Boy just to make jumps or to move around. I mean, do you really want to be seen in public playing this game? Well, actually, if you're playing this on the subway or on an airplane during harsh weather or on a roller coaster, Yoshi will probably end up dying from the shaking. To be honest, I just don't like the basic gameplay here. For me, Yoshi feels absolutely awful to play as. He also doesn't have some of his basic capabilities, like laying and throwing eggs. Instead, he just farts out ghosts. This game is just a gimmick for the sake of being a gimmick. I mean, does this really have any reason to exist? Did anyone want this to be their once-in-a-generation Yoshi game? Does anyone who worked on this game actually like it? They probably thought this was a stupid idea as well, but someone told them they needed to put out a GBA tilt sensor game. Another reason I wouldn't consider this a traditional Yoshi game is how the progression works. Basically, you need to earn medals to access new worlds, which is done by completing the tasks for each level, which I thought seemed kind of refreshing at first. But you realize these are here because there's not much to the levels themselves, and having to do these tasks quickly becomes repetitive, as it's usually just eat a certain amount of enemies, or a certain amount of apples, or collect a certain amount of coins. Felt like I'd seen everything this game had to offer less than halfway through, and by the end I was proven right. The only challenge I ever faced in this game was when my cartridge wasn't properly calibrated, so make sure you calibrate your cartridge to save some frustration. Next up is Yoshi Touch Go, an early DS title featuring exclusively touchscreen controls, which yeah, I'm personally not a fan of, and this came out only a year after Topsy-Turvy. 2 years in a row and 2 Yoshi games with gimmicky controls that I'm not fond of. I don't necessarily have anything against touchscreen controls when it doesn't hurt the playability of the title, but does anyone actually want to control Yoshi using touchscreen and no buttons? The answer is no. He's really damn slow and can't even run in this game. You just draw cloud bridges for him. Try to avoid getting hit at all, since one hit means instant death. The DS originally wasn't supposed to be the successor to the GBA, probably because Nintendo was afraid to replace the mighty Game Boy family, as their previous attempt backfired more than a little bit. Because of this, we wouldn't get legitimate new entries to Nintendo franchises on the DS until like 2006, with games like New Super Mario Bros. DS and Pokemon Diamond and Pearl. Touch Go was before that, when Nintendo was kind of afraid of releasing true sequels on the DS, and it feels like a mobile game. It's basically a high score chasing auto runner, although an auto runner I probably like more than Super Mario Run. But I kind of feel bad for anyone who bought this at full price back in the day, because it gets boring pretty quickly. Time Attack, where you have to save Baby Luigi before the time runs out, is the only mode that actually ends. The rest just go on forever. There's no real ending or objective to this game, besides maybe trying to get first on the leaderboards for all 4 games, which unlocks an extremely lame balloon popping quote-unquote mini-game on the title screen. The most boring thing in this game is probably the Baby Mario falling sections. And the highlight for me personally is the Marathon mode, which has changing environments as you go through and deliver Baby Mario to different colored Yoshis. To me, it's the mode that feels the closest to being a Yoshi game. This game does look nice though. Overall though, this just feels like a mobile game on the DS. I will say though, challenge mode, they weren't lying, is quite a challenge and very difficult to get first on the leaderboards. And now we have the latest Yoshi game, Yoshi's Crafted World. This is the first game in this video that actually has its fair share of fans, so it's possible you hate me now for putting it this low, but I'm just being honest about my feelings. Everyone always complains about Baby Mario's crying sound in the original Yoshi's Island, and I've personally never really found it very annoying, especially when it's not going to last very long. But the truth is that the entire soundtrack of Yoshi's Crafted World legitimately gives me a headache, and I'm not joking. Remember when Yoshi's Island had a badass soundtrack? What the hell happened over the years? Since I'm putting music from this game into this video, I have to apologize to everyone listening. I mean, even the composer of the previous game in the series, Woolly World, threw shade at this game's soundtrack. But I guess I'll start with what I like most about this game, and that's how this game looks. The environments are very creative and fun to look at, as it's made of all sorts of different materials, which is far more interesting than Woolly World, where almost everything is the same material. But I feel like this game relies so heavily on spectacle over engaging in more traditional Yoshi gameplay with how these levels are designed. I mean, what exactly am I doing here besides pressing forward? Yoshi himself feels too slow, and the emphasis on the 2.5D plane seems random and unnecessary as it's not very fun. Seems like a gimmick they'd maybe try on the 3DS, but why here? And you might think, well, to get the most out of this game you need to 100% it, and not just rush to the end of every level. Well, I did initially attempt to 100% this game, but it ended up being a total snooze fest as it consists of stopping to throw eggs at virtually everything you see in the background. Is this something anyone actually desired in their Yoshi games? And the game wants you to replay these levels multiple times to get all the crafts. Even if you've already thrown eggs at these crafts in the background, you can't actually collect them unless you first get the mission for it, otherwise they just give you coins. The problem with having to replay these levels so many times is that there's not much going on in terms of gameplay. Replaying levels works for arcade-style side-scrollers, where you want to improve at the levels each time, performance matters. So those games have earned replayability, whereas this game just wants you to replay these levels for the sake of padding. These levels aren't fun to replay when they rely on the spectacle and wow factor of your first time through, so it just feels like an absolute chore to try and 100% this game, which is why I ended up merely finishing the game and moved on to other things. Here we have Yoshi Safari. My first impression of this game was that it seemed like a fun romp, but I quickly found out the fatal flaw of this game, which is that it uses the Super Scope. This thing sucks, and I could only play for 23 minutes until mine stopped working. Normally the 6 batteries are supposed to last a few hours, but I guess there's something wrong with my gun, and it has never worked again besides those first 20 minutes. Although I guess I didn't consider that it could have been a problem with my signal. Yeah, you gotta put a signal on your TV to get this thing to work. I really don't know how we got such a downgrade from the NES Zapper that required none of these things, and is overall more enjoyable to handle. It's not hard at all to see why this thing was a failure. It's really bad when compared to just about any light gun peripheral. So I had to replay the entirety of Yoshi Safari on an emulator, because unfortunately there's no saving and I lost all my progress. And that's when I realized this game's really not fun to replay. There's not much to these levels and it's pretty much impossible to die in this game. The most interesting thing are certainly the boss fights, which mostly consist of Koopalings, but you gotta go through these really boring levels to get to them, and the whole game is over in just an hour. It's charming the first time through, but it's one of those games you play once to see everything in it and never touch again because there's really not any point. Although if you did want to, you need to find 6 more batteries. And now it's time for the game that started it all, simply Yoshi. Or at least it's technically the first game in the Yoshi franchise, and this was the best-selling game in the series for a long time until Yoshi's Island came out on the GBA, with the combined sales of the NES and Game Boy titles reaching almost 5 million. This game being a huge success probably has something to do with the game being called Yoshi. Alright, people wanted more of this guy after Super Mario World, so when they saw this game in the stores, it was a no-brainer. But I think most people ended up very disappointed when they actually started playing the game, and saw the gameplay has nothing to do with Yoshi really. It's just a falling block game, and the real reason the game is simply called Yoshi is because Game Freak needed to put out a game with a small scope that they could finish in a reasonable amount of time that was going to sell a ton to support themselves while they spent the next 5 years developing their passion project, Pokemon. Satoshi Tajiri, the director of Yoshi, did not take a salary on this passion project of his, so Yoshi surely helped out Game Freak for maybe a year or two at least. They still had to release 4 of their games and nearly went bankrupt, but yeah, that was the main purpose of Yoshi, to support Pokemon rather than giving Yoshi lovers what they actually wanted, which I think is probably why this game tends to be ranked last on lists like these, but in my opinion, the game is pretty decent. But it's a game you're gonna have to set your own goals in, and if you play aimlessly, you're probably not gonna be very into it. Even people who do NES or Game Boy challenges to beat every game in the libraries almost never end up seeing the real final ending cutscene on level 28 for this game, and call it quits much earlier than that. Basically, these cutscenes are Yoshi eating things, usually fruit, after clearing a level, but for me, Yoshi is just a pretty chill and fun game that doesn't really have anything wrong with it. It's just not as riveting to me as some other falling block puzzle games. While I prefer the NES version, they did recently find a secret third version of this game in the 2024 Game Freak leak in the source code of Pokemon Black and White. My guess is that this was an exercise for Game Freak to get used to working in the Black and White engine, and I feel like that shows that they think back fondly on this very important game in their history. This would have made for a neat DSiWare release, so it's kind of a shame they never bothered with that, but it makes sense as the only reason the original released was because Game Freak needed the money at the time. Putting this on the DSi shop would have amounted to 1 penny for them, so it seemed that this version of Yoshi served the exact same purpose as the original, which was to lead to Pokemon and nothing more. Now we have the first traditional Yoshi game I ever played, Yoshi's Island DS. For me though, nostalgia does little to elevate games. All that matters to me is if it's fun currently, and this game is pretty decent. As a child playing this game though, I was really into the museum, which has all the enemies you fought on your journey on display. I think I was just easily entertained back then, but honestly, this is still pretty cool and I'm surprised I haven't seen any other game do this. It's actually a neat completion bonus. This game's novelty is that instead of just Baby Mario, you have 5 different babies on your journey, although some of them will only stick around for one world. This makes the game memorable, but I don't think it adds anything all too fun or interesting to the Yoshi's Island formula. You have to switch babies to access certain parts of the level by finding a spot where you can call a stork, but most games you have all your abilities on you and you can switch them on the fly and don't have to potentially backtrack somewhere, so I'm not sure I care for this very much. My favorite baby to use was definitely Baby Bowser since he can shoot fireballs, but you don't get to keep him for long. This is probably the hardest traditional Yoshi game, and that mostly has to do with the lack of horizontal visibility or even just being able to see what's below you. This game has so much vertical visibility, yet there's often nothing on the top screen. I need to see more of what's in front of me, not above me. So there will be times where you get hit by an enemy you couldn't react to, or die just because you didn't know there were spikes or lava or a hole directly below you. This game also must have the most one-hit deaths of any Yoshi game, and has some surprisingly evil level design. The auto-scroll levels in this game though, and there are quite a few, are atrocious. They are really slow. This was 2005 and I guess they didn't know most people aren't really fans of auto-scroll levels, especially ones that move at a snail's pace. I'm also not a fan of these puzzle levels in this game, one I was stuck on for a while until I found the one specific flower pot that had a key in it. Yeah, this is not very fun design. These puzzle and auto-scroll levels are just really boring. Also, I really do not care for this gap in between the screens that ends up hiding things you wish were in view. The music in this game also leaves a lot to be desired. It's just really lame compared to the great music you would find on the SNES or N64. I still like this game overall, but it really feels like it's lacking the polish you'd expect from a traditional Yoshi game, probably because it wasn't actually developed by Nintendo. This game was brought to you by the Topsy-Turvy team, not the Yoshi's Island or Yoshi Story team. Yeah, I think that explains it. And here we got Yoshi's Woolly World. After the very successful Kirby's Epic Yarn, Goodfield was looking for the next Nintendo franchise to give the yarn treatment. And what better choice than Yoshi, the other guy that loves to eat everyone he encounters? The consensus seems to be that this is the second best Yoshi game, but as you can see it's a bit lower on my own list. This game does let you play as Mega Man Yoshi though, so I kind of see where you guys are coming from. I did mention earlier that I definitely prefer how Crafted World looks over this game. This game becomes kind of boring to look at for me after a certain point, as almost everything tends to be made out of wool and solid colors. So I definitely don't care for the wool aspect of this game, but despite how it looks and unlike Crafted World, this is definitely a Yoshi's Island game. But honestly, even though I finished both games 3 times, Epic Yarn and Woolly World have never been very memorable to me. The most memorable Goodfield game for me was definitely Wario Land Shake It, that used a hand-drawn art style from Production IG, and I would have loved to see the same treatment for Yoshi or Kirby, and Shake It felt like a real evolution in the Wario Land series, but apparently that game didn't sell well enough, I guess, killing the Wario Land series, and they haven't attempted to use this art style again, which I think is a real shame. Woolly World is also the only game I know that only requires you to play the first and last level, since you can just use beads to automatically clear the courses. In the 3DS version, they made it so you can get these beads very quickly by doing the newly added Poochie levels, so you don't ever have to play the actual game. You can just play these Poochie levels over and over instead. Or you can go to the Yoshi Theater, which features very cute stop-motion animated short films that are unfortunately on the 3DS, so the video quality isn't the best. But answering questions about these films correctly will reward you with 500 beads. So if you watch a 3DS speedrun for this game, it's just someone spinning beads on the levels to clear them for 20 minutes, and not actually playing the game at all other than the first and final levels. This is just such a strange design choice to me. I don't know why this is a thing in the game, but maybe it's because not all of these levels are winners, so they want you to be able to skip some of them. I mean, just read the comments for level 5 5-6 up shutter thread pass. Yeah, I don't think anyone likes this level. So while Yoshi's Woolly World is fun and worth playing at least once, for me it's a bit forgettable, and nothing about this game is going to have me wanting to revisit it time and time again like I would for my favorite platformers. Yoshi's Cookie is another game that I feel like I see a lot of people talking smack about on the interwebs. Seemingly just because it's not a platform game, this is another puzzle game. And as you can see, it's not a falling block puzzle game, thankfully. They instead went with a tile matching game where you need to match rows of various different cookies. And at least the name of this one isn't really trying to trick anyone, unless someone thought they'd be able to eat actual cookies. But this game surprisingly grew on me with each playthrough as I went through the Game Boy, NES, and Super Nintendo editions. The SNES version is my favorite due to having the nicest overall presentation, although I do prefer Chef Mario that is found in the NES version, although Yoshi himself is not even visible on screen when you're playing that one. Might be why a lot of Yoshi fans don't like this game. Although the graphics do not impress at all for a SNES game, especially in the Yoshi series, what I do really like about this version is the music, particularly the version of Chico's Post that I have playing in the background right now, a theme I also enjoy hearing in some Kunio-kun games. What's most notable about this version though is the newly added puzzle mode, where you have to clear a predefined grid of cookies in a limited number of turns. Yeah, I don't actually care when puzzle games add modes like this, but I find that when I play the main action mode, the hours go flying by and I don't even notice. This game is actually quite addictive, and that probably has to do with its pace, as you need to go fast before too many cookies appear on the screen causing you to lose. This is quite a bit faster paced than Yoshi, as you're never waiting for anything to happen, you're always just playing the game. That all being said, this is still merely my second favorite tile matching Yoshi puzzle game on the Super Nintendo. Yoshi's Story. This is one that I played when I was like 7 years old, but don't think I actually finished back then, because this is the only Yoshi game with limited continues. If one of your Yoshis dies, they're gone for good. That's right, permadeath in a Yoshi game, which I think is actually very cool and arcade-like. There's also many different routes you can potentially play this game in, kind of like Star Fox 64, although I don't really see people complain about the length of that game, since they understand you're supposed to go through it many times. That also applies to Yoshi's Story, so I think it's silly when people criticize the short length. Tax this to different levels. You have to collect all 3 hearts in a world to make every level in the next world available. Once you beat a level, it'll appear in the trial mode, which is good for practicing if you want to route and locate all melons in a level, as eating every melon in a level will give you a perfect score. Although I must admit I don't like this game enough to try and attempt a full melon run, so I just eat every fruit I come across, which works just fine for me as I'm not very into collectathon games. But this one here was done very well and I don't get bored with it nearly as quickly. This game is also novel for being a 2D platformer, which sounds silly to say, but this is an N64 game and there are barely any 2D platformers on the console. It's also one of the best looking games in the library in my opinion. I don't love how Yoshi handles in this game though, and there are some things I find underwhelming like the pitiful boss fights. But in my view this was a perfectly acceptable follow-up to Yoshi's Island that I don't think warranted the criticism it received, as it's still one of the best Yoshi games. Yoshi's New Island. That's right, just like Super Mario, Yoshi gets the new treatment. And thankfully this was the only time. Look, I'm with you guys that this game is quite uninspired from beginning to end, with the main innovation of this game being a big egg. Because of course it is when Yoshi gets newified. But look, I enjoyed this game from start to finish, and I'm only a little bit afraid to admit that. This game really doesn't have levels that I find to be annoying or complete boring slogs. There are a few auto-scrollers, and this game simply sticks to the formula, which I think the game really benefits from not having stupid half-baked gimmicks. It's not as though I'm bored of standard Yoshi when it's barely been done. Every other Yoshi game tried to do something different when really, most people just wanted Yoshi's Island again. And that's what this game is. No silly controls or attempting to use both screens for the levels. I mean really, this game definitely understood the flaws of Yoshi's Island DS, as they stuck to only the top screen here. No, I don't think it's as good as Yoshi's Island. I really do enjoy the visuals, but it doesn't provide nearly as much eye candy as the original game, and the soundtrack especially leaves a lot to be desired, which is unfortunately the case for pretty much every Yoshi game once you exit the 90s. But I really don't have any major complaints for this game. I suppose it could have been longer as the reduced difficulty does make it a breeze, though my main complaint is that the first Yoshi's Island is still better, which is also true for every Yoshi game, although there is one that got close. And that is Tetris Attack. If I were forced to play any Yoshi game for 500 hours straight, it'd have to be this one. Mostly because, like Tetris, this game has a high skill ceiling, allowing for constant improvement the more you play it, which I think makes it rewarding to get good at and to return to time and time again. But as a game that I'm not very good at and just play from time to time, it'd have to still be only number 2. But if you play any of the games in this video for hundreds and hundreds of hours, I think you'd be the least bored of Tetris Attack after all that time. I definitely prefer the Super Nintendo version over the Game Boy version, because the backgrounds of this game are so nice to look at versus just white that's on the Game Boy. But the Game Boy version would still also earn this number 2 spot by itself. Now this game is often excluded on these Yoshi lists because if you look at the box art, he's not even on it. But when you actually start the game, you're greeted with this. Is this yet another game on this list using false advertisement to trick people to buy it? Particularly boomers like Hillary Clinton who like Tetris but don't know what a Yoshi is? Yes. And even the Tetris co-founder said he regrets letting Nintendo use the Tetris name for this game. And Yoshi is only here to cover up the original anime art style of the Japanese version, Panel de Pon, because anime was not allowed to be seen in games back in the day. But the Yoshi version did end up releasing in Japan on the Satellaview as BS Yoshi no Panipon and Yoshi no Panipon on the Game Boy. Kinda like how they also eventually released Super Mario USA in Japan. So this is still very much a Yoshi game, but also technically a game in two other franchises, Tetris and Panel de Pon. This game is also very satisfactory when it comes to content, with its various modes of play, versus mode, stage clear mode, time trial, puzzle mode, and endless mode, which isn't actually endless if you max out the score because it'll end the game and show you the credits, but that's quite a challenge to pull off. So yeah, tons to do in this game, so we definitely came a long way from the first Yoshi puzzle game, which was pretty bare bones. And coming at number 1 to the surprise of approximately 0 viewers, we have Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island. Miyamoto could have just brought us a normal sequel very similar to Super Mario World, like we saw with the NES games, but the thing is those games are outliers in Miyamoto's work, as usually when he makes sequels they'd be entirely original games, even featuring different playable characters, all the way back with Donkey Kong Jr. hijacking Jumpman's role. But interestingly, this is not the first Super Mario game to be hijacked by another character, as Wario did it first in 1994. You might think that this game influenced Yoshi's Island, but this game took almost 5 years of development time, by far the longest at the time for a Super Mario game. But I'd love to see this sort of thing happen again where a different character gets to star in a Super Mario game, but for the longest time all the Super Mario games to come out after Yoshi's Island were very, very samey. But unlike Wario, I don't even understand how you come up with this concept here. But this is Miyamoto we're talking about, although this game also has 4 people credited as the directors. Unlike the other games in this video, the original Yoshi's Island is actually pretty badass, from the soundtrack to the foes you fight to the overall feel of the game. It definitely has my favorite soundtrack of the 2D Super Mario games. There's great variety in this game, always new things to see throughout. There was a huge lack of variety in the boss battles in Mario 3 and World, and these boss battles themselves weren't at all interesting. So this game definitely has them beat when it comes to that with all these different boss fights. This game being in development for so long allowed them to get the graphics just right. The developers themselves said that this was probably the most challenging aspect of making this game. They wanted to go against the trends to make something that looked handmade and didn't use realistic 3D computer graphics that they thought would get more and more common, and well, they were right. That decision really paid off, as this is arguably the best looking game on the system. I'm sure many people didn't even think this was possible on the SNES. I should definitely bring up the GBA version, which would also earn this spot by itself, but I do prefer the original game's audio a whole lot more, as well as the graphics. These levels were also not made with the GBA screen size in mind, but there were 6 extra new levels added on the GBA version, so for that reason this is the definitive Yoshi's Island for some. Admittedly, this is the only Super Mario game I have no interest in 100%ing. I've seen it take people over 30 hours. There's hundreds and hundreds of things to collect, and I'd probably have to use a guide to even know where to find all of them. It really just seems tedious to me, although chances are it's still a better experience than going for all the blue coins in Super Mario Sunshine, which I did do. While Yoshi's speed is perfectly acceptable, this game is also slower paced than Super Mario due to its level design often involving puzzles that to me aren't actually all that fun to do. While this isn't exactly a favorite of mine among the classic Super Mario games, I think it's pretty obvious that out of all the games in this video, this one had the most care put into it. They knew this was going to be the last Super Mario on the SNES, and was going to potentially be the last 2D console Mario ever, as console gaming would shift to 3D very soon after. So they decided to go out with a bang, which led to an entire new franchise, and as a result this video here that you almost certainly disagreed with, so I'd love to hear your own personal ranking or favorite Yoshi games in the comments.